So I'd scan an image, and then to essentially get this sort of look, I'm using Photoshop. So I'm making digital files, and then I'm printing these on, in this case, it's Barita paper, which is paper that holds these blacks very well, very hard to get deep blacks. And it's through a process of Photoshop. Now, when you use Photoshop, I often say now it's more like painting with pixels. I am moving pixels around. So, you know, when people say, are you a photographer? I sort of say, yeah, you know. I mean, I use photographs. I make pictures using photographs. After that, I'm moving pixels around. So really, that's the methodology. And Photoshop's like anything else. It's a tool, and you basically get better at it by using it in different ways. And learning to use it creatively is mainly about making a lot of mistakes and throwing the stuff out. I mean, to get to something like this, one of the things that's maybe a bit different from my work and other photographers, I often say, is I don't really have a model out there in the world of what I think something should look like. I'm trying to sort of make something that's kind of internal, so I don't really know what these things are going to look like until I start getting there. And that's one of the problems and challenges of doing this kind of work. But I use Photoshop primarily to do that, and any other materials I've got. So for example, on this work, on this side, you see all the text there looks like it's typewritten. That typewritten, the type on that comes from the court documents I referred to before. I basically made my alphabet from the court documents. It's an old Olivetti typewriter, or at least it came from that. I basically photographed that typeset and then imposed it using Photoshop. So really, these are like that kind of digital photo montage. In fact, I was in a show on the history of photo montage where they had things back from the 30s right up to my stuff, which is sort of the contemporary version of it. At least that's one way of looking at it. Yeah.
Frank, you might want to mention that your editions are incredibly small.
Well, I do small editions. This is also one of the sort of issues with photography. I mean, I do these in editions of 5. So,
that's it.
You know, and I don't sort of mess around with my editions. I don't sort of say, well, it's 5 this size, but if you want this size, it's another 5. And, you know, this size, it's going to be another 15. I do 5, and if I sell 5, that's great. I keep 2 artist proofs for myself because I want to exhibit them in other places. But when I sell out the edition, I'm out. And you know what? You know, people say, well, suppose somebody else wants it. I say, fine, you can buy it from somebody who's already got it, because I don't want to think about it again.
Why is this an important point from the buyer's perspective? It's because if he were to make 200 of them, you know, do you want to own something? I wouldn't. That is that big an edition. It has more intrinsic value, in my view. I'm a bit biased because I'm the gallery owner.
Thanks.
Sure. Other.
You know what I find fascinating is, I'm also an artist, is that you don't know where you're going. And if anybody tells you as an artist that they do know, they're bullshitting you. And they're fooling themselves, because you really, in the process of doing it, you're discovering things.
I think that's
that's the fascinating part, and the beautiful part, and the one that really engages.
Although you have to, I remember hearing the dean of Yale Art School talking, and he was saying one of the problems with so much theoretical stuff that people were relying so much in theory. He was talking about the master's program they had in art at Yale, was that they were using theory as a template for the work they were making. And he was actually very dissatisfied with what was coming out of his MFA program because of that. It was too theoretical. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with theory. I don't have any problem with that. In fact, I come from an academic background. But, I don't know. If I want to write an essay, I'll write an essay. When you want to make a picture, there's some... I'm making a picture because it's a different language.
What brought you to actually, you know, to use these techniques? Like, what What brought you to this point? I mean, you could have
Yeah.
expressed your story, your life, your mother's life in a different technique, in a different way. But why this image of deterioration and texture and
Okay. Yeah. I mean, first of all, if you look at my earlier work, it looks very different, but you'll see some continuity. In other words, it was never about the straight image. I really mistrust precise images. Just like I mistrust precise prose. I like things that are sort of a
No,
little...
but these images are very emotional.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and that's the other thing, is I think partially because I was an academic for the first sort of part of my life, and it was a very non-emotional type thing, or at least you were using that part. I really wanted to move into something that was more an expression of sort of the emotional self. As for things like the textures and so forth, the way I talk about it formally, I sometimes say that I'm collapsing foreground, subject, and background. And in an emotional sense, it's because when you're, like when I think about it with my mother, there's my mother out there, there's me. But really, my experience of my mother is us as a kind of field together. And all the baggage that both of us brought, and all the stuff that's between us. And in a way, that's a kind of almost textured, foggy environment that I'm trying not to cut through. Because that at a certain point, that's one of the things I realized I couldn't do with the work. I couldn't cut through that fog. What I wanted to do was show the fog. Because I couldn't dispel it. You know, sometimes people make art because they think, well, I want to clarify the situation. I don't want to clarify because I know the situation can't be clarified. I couldn't clarify it in half a century. I'm not going to clarify it. It's just, you know, Primo Levi once said, he said, you know, I see the riddle, but I don't see the answer. And that's how it's always seemed. I could never really, I mean, even saying something like coming to terms with this is something that I almost laugh at myself, even saying those words. It's impossible, at least for me, to come to terms with this, because all it is a big miasma of stuff. So when you see a lot of these elements, yeah, it's the stuff in between it. It's sort of words and phrases running between it. It's textures. One of my favorite writers is W.G. Sebald, and he often talked about the fog as the ultimate metaphor for just living. It's stuff that you can't see.
At the beginning, you mentioned failure.
Yeah. Where's the failure?
Yeah.
The failure is, I think the failure comes with, at the beginning, maybe thinking I was going to come out of this at a very, very different end point than what I started with. And really what I learned, what did Edna St. Vincent Millay said? She said, life is not one thing after another. It's the same damn thing over and over again. And that's kind of what I came out with. I sort of thought, no, I haven't really explained this to I failed to explain this to myself. But at least what I did, I guess, was I made something out of it. That's all I can say.
Was there a compulsion, like you have to do it? It wouldn't leave you alone?
You know, the way I choose what I'm going to do is pretty simple. I've never really had a problem choosing what I was going to do next. I basically think, what's the thing that's most on my mind and in my heart right now? And I work on that. And sometimes it doesn't turn out to anything. So after my mother died, that seemed like a natural enough thing. And look, people say, well, how come you didn't do as much on your father? The reason's very simple. My father wasn't as important to me as my mother. It's not, yeah, she just didn't have that, he didn't have that impact on my life.
So
He
you're saying
was
there
much
was-
more ghost-like. That's how they managed to have a marriage for 58 years.
You mentioned that you were an only child, and these are very generational.
Yeah.
Is there any family left to
Yeah.
respond, react to
That's
your vision?
I was one, yeah. Hardly anybody. There's two. I have seen one family member, blood family. I've seen one once in the last 25 years. The reason for that is, first of all, we're lousy procreators. I don't have kids either. The other thing is, my mother kind of blew a lot of the relationships in my family to pieces before she went deep into Alzheimer's. She kind of burned a lot of bridges. And that's an unfortunate thing.
Yeah.
It's funny, somebody once asked me, why don't you have kids? Is it because you think the world's a terrible place? I don't really care about the world. It's more like just my vision of family was never terribly positive. So I never really thought this is something, I sort of thought, like, well, what do I want, diphtheria? It's just not something I wanted. So in a way, it just, unfortunately my mother did, she burned a lot of bridges, and that's an unfortunate thing. I sometimes wondered if I was going to get an email. I did have one so-called friend of the family, not my friend, say that I'd done a bad thing. I'm cleaning up the language. That didn't matter to me. Hi. Yeah.
You refer to the distorted memory. And you are also referring to everything will be forgotten.
Yeah.
But in essence, what you've done is everything has been remembered.
Yeah.
And, the thing I find interesting is that 15, 20, 30 years ago, people would have trusted memory purely. And through DNA and, Project Innocence and things like that, people now have come to understand how creative
Yeah.
the memory is
And to
and
see
how we will build and manufacture.
Yeah.
And do you feel that's what's happening?
I try to remember things accurately, but again, I'll give you a specific example. That picture of the horse, that I was so fixated, and I was so convinced for years that this thing was tattooed on my brain, that I absolutely knew what it looked like. And then I find the picture and it looks completely different.
The thing that I've always found interesting is that when you look at found material, and particularly family pictures, they are a captured moment that always involves that happy smile. And quite often they have nothing to do with what's really going on.
And it's
So you have that structured moment, and then the camera stops, and everything goes back to
that picture, I once showed that picture of my mother holding me and the balloons, and they said, well, she must have loved being a mother. Well, geez, it's just one moment. It's not quite that simple. But people want to believe. They just, I've always said the great thing about photography is it is a beautiful liar.
Yes.
It is the most deceitful, dishonest medium out there, and that's one of its virtues.
And as soon as the camera appears, the subject transforms.
Yeah, and so in a way, this work, where I've transformed, I think I've been more honest to the photographic image than most photographs.
Everything will be remembered.
Yeah, and about that title, people said, there's a journalist who did some work on my stuff for a while. She wrote me an email saying, no, everything won't be forever. What I mean by that title is really, as I thought about it, aside from the fact that I was trying to come up with something halfway interesting, it's sort of a reminder to me, both of the fact, yes, that we're going to try to remember, but for my mother, everything is forgotten. Maybe not for me right now, but for her, it's memento mori. I will forget this stuff eventually.
There is a picture that caught you from the Holocaust. There's young Frank, a ghost in the house. There's the years of experiencing your mother going through her personal dissolution. And since her death, there's been the years that you have made your own journey into the dark here. What would you say has been the effect on you of that journey? Because we did not answer that avoids the issue of our own personal dissolution.
The first word that comes to mind is it's just and I don't mean this in a self-effacing way, it's humbling in the sense that, you know, I think one of the myths that you grow up with as a kid is you're really going to do better than your parents. So people have all kinds of metrics for that, right? People have the metrics of economic success or education. And in those ways, I did better. But what does that mean to do better? I don't know that, I guess one of the things as I go through this is, I don't know that I hope I handled certain things better, whatever that means, but I don't know that I did. And I know I'm the worst person to judge that. So, I mean, just to go back to that whole idea of the fog, it just gives you know, it reminds me of a pie chart. You know, and if you divide the pie chart into stuff we don't know, stuff I don't know and stuff I do know, the stuff I do know is the tiniest slice. And the rest of it is all the stuff I don't know. And that's something that I came to appreciate in a way, more experientially than just intellectually. I feel bad for her. I do. I really do. Sometimes I wish I could have told her that. But it was impossible. It was very hard to do at the time. Yeah, I have to think more about that question. And maybe it will come to me. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, there's a slight discrepancy between, you know, your statement that your mom, God bless her, she was living within her own dilemma, and you just accept that and forgiveness and all of that. And then,
I don't forgive her.
okay,
Yeah, I do not.
well, maybe that's the answer to my question. So you have a statement about understanding her dilemma,
Different.
and at the same time over here, you've got so much pain.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, if that's a good point. You know, it's not that I sort of make a decision not to forgive. It's that forgiveness doesn't really enter into it. It's like redemption. It's not something I think about. It's not something my mother would have thought about either. I don't have any belief in resolving this.
But there's an acceptance.
No. There's you know what? There's grief. There's grief that it all happened.
I'm trying to recall those words you used when you talk about,
I probably contradicted myself.
which is what we do.
But as I think about it at this very moment, there's a kind of grief about everything that happened, and
Well, that was my next question. You said you feel bad for your mother.
yeah.
How do you feel for yourself?
I feel bad about certain things. I mean, look, one of the problems, and anybody who comes from, doesn't matter how many degrees, well, it does matter, but Helen Epstein wrote a very good book on children of Holocaust survivors, and it's a really great book, and it's based on research that she did at McGill, because there were a lot of kids that came over, a lot of kids that were born in Montreal from Holocaust survivors, and one of the things that was absolutely verboten, forbidden, is the idea of feeling sorry for yourself. You just never, if you didn't wake up, I mean, it was pretty clear to me, if you didn't wake up in wooden clogs and prison stripes, you better shut the up and just get on with it. And that's a real hard one for me. I mean, what I mean is, it's really hard for me to feel bad about what happened for myself. I mean, I'm better at it than I used to. But that whole idea of you never had it hard enough makes feeling this. I have a feeling that's probably why I did this stuff, now that I think about it. Maybe it's a way I could make something out of it that I couldn't really admit to myself. Maybe. Probably. In a way, I could put it 1 degree of separation away from myself. I mean, I could admit it at 3 in the morning. I could admit these things, but not outside of 3 in the morning when I'm alone. But I mean, I'll give you a concrete example of something. And again, I don't say this is a boo-hoo story. Everybody has a sad story. One of the things I've really appreciated from reading Helen Epstein's book is she talked about something that these kids did, and I realized I did it too. And one of the things was, when I moved to Toronto at the age of 30, I changed dentists. And I was having a tooth fixed, and the dentist gave me an anesthetic. And I said, that didn't hurt at all. And he said, wow, you've had very deep cavities, almost like root canals. You've had this before. I said, I've never had an anesthetic in my life when I've had my teeth fixed. And that's because I couldn't admit that things were hurting. So I would white knuckle things. And this was really true among other kids, because the idea was, you can't admit you need a painkiller. In fact, you'd better learn from that pain. This is something that was just very sharply rammed into me. You're a lucky kid, you're too lucky, and you ought to learn the way things can be. It's not right. I know it's not right. But just because you know something's not right doesn't mean it doesn't get bred into your bones after a while. And it's that old thing where, the 3 issues you identified, when you were 28, they're often the 3 issues you die with. It doesn't mean you die with them exactly in the same state, but those are the things that you've had to come to terms with and learn which shelf to put them on.
Yes, we're talking about death and it's all black and it's party, singing and all that, but especially in your childhood pictures. Do you feel reborn after doing this? Because it seems to me you have forgotten what you so kept in your mind, your heart, and perhaps there is a rebirth?
So the question is sort of how did I feel after I did these?
It's almost like the kid is...
Yeah, how did I feel? I think more a kind of... when I work on these things, I actually feel a lot of... When I'm actually working on them, I feel a certain detachment, because they become materials to work with. It's a little like writing. I mean, those of you that are writers, like Cedric, a poet, the words acquire an objective reality. You move these things around. Afterwards, I don't know how to explain. I guess I have the pleasure of creating something. Do I feel? I don't know that I feel so different, but at least I don't feel like I didn't do anything with it. For some reason, there is some reward in having done something with it.
So you want to liberate?
No, I don't feel liberated. No, I really don't. I really don't. But I at least feel glad that I've done something with it. And there is a little bit, and I suppose this comes from ego, this idea that I've left a bit of a breadcrumb trail for somebody else to look at. It is quite rewarding, really. When I was in Russia, and I showed that work, the picture of my mother, there was a young woman who came up to me, and she was kind of weeping. And she said, I took pictures of my father when he died, and my mother's never forgiven me for it. Do you think it's okay what I did? And I sort of thought, you're asking me. It's sort of like, I'm saying, go girl. I said, that's, obviously I made the choice that was all right for me. And so there is something rewarding about connecting sometimes with people on that basis. It's not the primary reason for doing something. When I do this, the stages I work in when I'm making work like this is I make it first for myself. But part of sharpening the work is to help it communicate better. Sometimes I'll say, okay, this part, maybe only I can read this. Can I make this maybe so that at least 2 other people in the world can read it? And so there is that element of communication, and sometimes it is kind of a rewarding thing when somebody says something that it meant something to them. And that's kind of a nice thing. And it is like any form of human communication. It doesn't have to lead to redemption. the act of communicating, the act of sort of taking a walk together is a reward in itself. I mean, so there's it's sort of like, it's like friendship, really. It's a very high end in itself. I don't need a whole lot more than that. I don't expect anything.
It comes from the soul, it comes from your inner self.
You know, I'm kind of keeping myself company. You know, that's part of what I'm doing. I'm kind of keeping myself company. Kafka had this really funny thing he said once. Somebody once asked Franz Kafka, because he was Jewish, right? And somebody said, do you feel like you have a lot in common with Jews? And he said, I don't even feel like I have anything in common with myself. And perfect Kafka statement, right? And sometimes after doing this, I actually feel like I might have a thing or two in common with myself. It doesn't make any sense at all, but somehow it feels like that. It might actually make, it actually feels like there's something there. Okay, by all means, take a look around. Really, thanks again for being out here, for taking the time. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your great questions. Thanks again so much.